What were the first sights they saw, the things that surrounded them? And as I was working through Würzburg, I said to myself, but I have my own place. And my own place is not as beautiful as Würzburg, but it has a beauty of its own.
Whoa, Haifa, Haifa. Greetings to my fellow explorers of all things Jewish. I'm really excited to bring you this video. It's the first time that I've ever conducted a real full-on interview, this time with the author and Professor Nili Scharf Gold, who's also a family friend, and who recently wrote this book, Haifa, City of Steps, about the literature and landscape of the city of Haifa, one of Israel's biggest and most important cities. And I think you'll really enjoy the discussion. People were there that had read the book, that hadn't read the book, and all got a lot out of it. So please comment below with any questions or insights as you watch the video. And there'll be more information in the link description about how to purchase the book or about the author. But I'm really excited to share this with you, so here we go.
It was particularly meaningful to have this celebration here in this home that is so filled. Like, if you look through the walls, are all this Israeli art. There's such a strong presence of Israeli art. And Tobias's grandmother, Danny's mother and Sandy's mother-in-law, Tova, came here right before the story of the book begins. So the story of the book begins in 1948, or at least a part of it. I mean, I go back to history, but she came here in 1947 and carried with her the culture and everything that actually made the 48 possible. And so you cannot talk about 48 onward without talking about 47 back. And so in some way, this is a continuation, and it's really thrilling. And thank you. And so the genesis of the book. So I wrote a book about Yehuda Amichai and the Israeli poet. And I invested a very long time and a lot of energy in understanding where he came from. Because what I was saying, Amichai is known to those who know him as an Israeli par excellence. He is like, he grew up in Israel, he's the poet of Jerusalem, he fought in the wars, he's a man, the quintessential Israeli. But what I wanted to show, or I thought succeeded in showing, is that he came to Israel when he was 12 years old, and that the first 12 years of his life were very, very remarkable in his, not only in who he became, but in the poetry that he wrote. And in order to show this, I went back to his hometown. I went to Würzburg, which is in southern Germany. It's in Franconia, Great Bavaria. Beautiful medieval town, Catholic town, with Baroque palaces and churches and bridges. And I said, one can only understand someone's insides if one knows the landscape of that person, the landscape in which that person grew up. So I cannot understand Amichai's poetry or the architecture of that let's say Burwald designed, or anybody's work of art output without understanding where they came from. What were the first sights they saw, the things that surrounded them? And as I was working through Würzburg, I said to myself, but I have my own place. And my own place is not as beautiful as Würzburg. At least it's not, doesn't have Tiapolo ceilings, and it doesn't have putis, and it doesn't have fancy fountains and palaces, but it has a beauty of its own. And this is, so even before starting this book, I started thinking about writing about Haifa. And I actually published the first article about the connection between the writing of one writer and Haifa in 2006, which was 2 years before I published my Amichai book. So that was the genesis.
Great. And one of the things that I really enjoyed while reading the book is that you see both the history of the development of Haifa, but it's also narrated through Nili's eyes as a youth, living there from ages 0 to 18. And it also then sets you on your own thought process of how did your hometown or where you're living currently inform your eyes. So I'm now rethinking growing up in Tenafly, that this great White House on Clinton Avenue is like a landmark, and what I haven't yet really asked the questions of what did that mean, but those are the kinds of questions that you jump into. What does a given intersection say to a person, etc. So as we also think about our own city, New York, or where we're from, what can we take from your exploration into how we go about our own hometown or city?
Yeah, that's a big question. So actually, when I spoke in Georgetown and I was talking about Haifa, at the end this woman came over to me and she said her name was Eva Maria something. She had a very long Polish last name. And she was crying and she said, as you were talking, I was thinking of Warsaw. I was thinking of Warsaw the whole time. And Haifa is not at all like Warsaw. But that idea of, and we all remember so much more than we know we remember. And I went back to the places. So I remembered many things, but also going back to the same places, seeing them with new eyes, with a grown-up eyes. And I was amazed that when we went to City Hall, which is a beautiful building, and I was lucky to have an assistant architecture student who came with me, and I said to her, the floors are red. Now, I was there the last time when I was 6, and we walked in, and sure enough, the floors were red. And it was really etched in me, those visions, even though I did not understand them. But what was wonderful was to retroactively understand them. So while and I talk a little bit about it, my nursery school was near the Technion, the original building of the Technion, which is now a beautiful science museum that was actually refurbished. And I remember the teeth, and on top of the Technion, if you see, there are teeth like that. And I had no idea.
Is that one of the images we have?
Yeah, we can, it's kind of an amazing, here. So I can just show you. So you see the teeth, and I remember those teeth, but I had absolutely no idea why those teeth were there. But then I studied it, and what I learned was that Alexander Berwald, the architect who was 30 years old when he designed it, that Haifa was chosen to be the site of the Technion because it was perceived as a neutral place. In Tel Aviv, people were very political, were too Zionistic, were too into opinions and fights of their opinions. In Jerusalem, people were too religious and too busy with the religious fights. And Haifa was neutral. And this is why the founders of the Technion, who were not Zionists, the first people who, and everybody forgets that, so I would like to say that Paul Nathan, the head of the German Society for benefiting Jews, Ezra, he is the one who thought about it.
In which decade?
It was in the very beginning, turn of the 20th century. And then people, at the same time, people at the Zionist Congress also started thinking about the same idea. And they were going to build this amazing building that will be like the Jewish MIT. And it will be a world-renowned institution. And it was going to be, and it was, the biggest technological institution in the entire Ottoman Empire. And the German Kaiser supported it. And they turned to this young man, whose name was Alexander Berwald, who worked in the public works department in Berlin, because he was Jewish. He was not necessarily very Jewish or religious or anything, but he was a Jewish architect. And they said, okay, you're going to design this. And he went to what was Palestine, to Ottoman Palestine, and studied. And what he came with, the plan he came was some kind of amalgamation, or fusion as you call it, of German classicism or European classicism. You see the building has like Palladian proportions. It has a dome in the middle. It is very classical looking. But Bervel never forgot that he was in the Middle East. And he wanted to incorporate into his creation, into his Palladian classical creation, to incorporate the aesthetics of the Middle East. And the teeth are Assyrian, actually. So no, they're not even Arab. It's Ashur. You know, it predates.
And nor Jewish, nor Israeli or
not
Jewish.
Jewish, not Islamic. Pre. That's why he put the teeth. But he also had arches that were very much in the Islamic tradition, the Islamic aesthetics, and he wanted to he built it with stones that he did not want to be flat. They carved the stones, and the story goes that the workers tried to polish the stones because they were building this kind of temple for science, and they were in awe of what was going to be built. So they polished it, and Berwald came and said, no, I don't want it polished. The stone had to be local. It had to be to show that it was a part of the landscape. So this is I don't know why I talked about that, but never mind.
We're going there anyway.
So,
great, thank you. So just as the architecture...
I'm sorry, yes, now
yes.
I do remember.
Comment?
Because you asked about how you go
bring it
about
back.
finding out about your own hometown. So I did remember going as a little girl playing in the garden that was in front of the Technion. And all the mothers and babies and everybody was there. And I remember it very clearly. And I remember the teeth. And I remember that building that I was like overwhelmed by it. But I had no idea what went into it. And now as an adult, I learned, and it was so much richer and so much more interesting.
Great. And the book really helps you get to Haifa and feel that you're there. Just raise your hand if you've ever been to Haifa. That's a pretty high percentage. Not to single out maybe the one or two, but if you haven't been to Haifa, all right. So I actually only really went to Haifa. My last trip to Israel in January, and only had 36 hours there. So I didn't see all the places mentioned in the book. But having been there for a moment, and then also the way you bring us into the locations. You can really feel the city even if you're not there. And one of the best features for that is that the book, every chapter begins with a map that was made for this work. So would you show us and tell us about the maps?
Yeah, so this is the map for chapter 5. But I can... Okay, so this is the map. But you can look at the details later. But I'd like to tell you about those maps because so first of all, it really is thrilling for me to know that so many people visited Haifa because I speak to other groups. And many people who visited Israel, I'm not talking about people who never went to Israel, but people who visited Israel skip Haifa.
I had lived there for 2 years, and it was my first real time going there only a few months ago. So.
Right, so people go to Jerusalem, they go to Tel Aviv, and then when they think that like the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus went, is great, so maybe they stay over one night in Haifa, they look at the Bahai temple, there's a golden dome, and then they have breakfast and continue to the Sea of Galilee and totally skip Haifa. So it's really thrilling for me that you saw Haifa, that you know Haifa. But the idea of the book, I actually wanted it to be like a guided tour in I wanted to take my reader through Haifa, but not Haifa. It's true that the book is called Haifa City of Steps, but I asked the publisher at the beginning objected to it, but it says right under, it says Landscape and Literature of Hadar Carmel, because the book, although it does talk about the history of Haifa in general, between the lines, the focus of the book is Hadar Carmel, is my neighborhood, is the neighborhood where I was born, where I was raised, and the route of the book goes from west to east, beginning with the area of my first home in Haifa, the first 6 years in Haifa, which was an area that was closer to where public buildings were, but also to the Arab neighborhoods, and then going east, and I'm talking the whole thing is like 20-minute walk, but going east to the other side of Hadar Carmel, where my last home in Haifa was, and on each station I stick around. The main thoroughfare of Hadar Carmel is called Herzl Street, and that's very important. I'll tell you in a minute why. But I go down the slope and up the slope. In Haifa, you don't go north or south, you go up and down. So you go down Herzl Street and you go up from Herzl Street, and on each one of my stations, there are 5 stations in the book, 5 hubs. Each one of them, I talk about works of literature that connect to those points and works of architecture that connect to those points, and but memories that connect to those points. So I really needed a map, but I couldn't use a Google map. And I couldn't use like a standard map. And I was very lucky, and I met this woman through somebody else who was never in Israel, is not Jewish, does not know Hebrew, does not have any idea, but is a wonderful artist. And with Google Maps and with the plans of buildings that I sent her and photographs and hours of sitting together, she actually drew those maps that are true, that size-wise are true, that copy the buildings, that copy everything. And there's something very naive about them, but at the same time, they're very accurate, and they show all the points in each.
And the naivete of them also fits with you being a child as the story progresses. Another feature of the book, which we started to see, is the photos. So one that we don't have a big display of, but there's a photo in front of the old district courthouse that caught my eye in particular. There's 4 men in the foreground, 2 men off to the side, and sort of men waiting behind. And everyone has a completely distinct fashion. There's judges that look Arab and judges that look Western, with a wig even. There's also people in sort of soldiers' garb. And then there's 2 characters off to the side that maybe are journalists or just unofficial folk. And this photo really spoke to me in that it captures all the different dynamics that besides the women, all the different dynamics that are going on in the city. A very, very alive photo. And there's also you see different expressions. The judges are looking very self-assured and proud of themselves for something, and the journalists look more skeptical. It's a very character-filled photo. So I mentioned that it was one of my favorite in the book, and then Nili, you mentioned that there was a story behind it.
Yeah.
I can pull it up if you want.
Yeah, so actually I started telling you about the Technion, right, and the arches of the Technion. So the Technion was like and then actually when I wrote it, I said the Technion was the father of the neighborhood, and my publisher said, no, you don't say father, you say parent. And but to me, in Hebrew is a very gender-oriented language, and a building is masculine. So the Technion is a father. So whatever. But anyway, a parent or a father of the neighborhood, and the public buildings of the neighborhood were very much inspired by the architecture of the Technion, but of course they were more modern. And this specific building, the building of the courthouse, was built in 1932 by a British colonial architect. He was not a Jewish architect, and he was very influenced and inspired by those arches, but also by modernism, and designed this very, very lovely building in 1932. And the entrance is and if you look at the map, you see the people, like British garb. You see, wigs, and you see
page 41 if you have a book in front of you.
And you see policemen, and you see all kinds of. So Billy and I went to Haifa to this man whose name was Yeri Rimon, who was the biggest collector of everything Haifa. Thousands of postcards and photographs and articles and everything. He himself was a physicist, a graduate of Princeton University, and after he retired at age 65, he started collecting. And when we came to him, he said, "Oops, I just gave away my entire collection." True story. However, he said, just this very, very kind man, said, however, I have one album of photographs that I love the most, and those I did not give, and let me show them to you. And he started flipping through those photographs, and there was the entrance to the courthouse. And it was so amazing because it showed what Haifa was in 1932. It was British and Arabs and Jews and the whole thing. And the building was new, and you could see those arches. And I said, "Oh, that one." And he said, let me make a copy for you. Man was 80-something years old, and he got up, and he went to his machine, and he scanned it, and he give me a disc, and on the disc he wrote for Nili Gold, and he said, "You can use it anywhere you want. Here it is." He doesn't. We don't know who the photographer is, but he was the owner. He said, "You can use it." And unfortunately, he died. He just died. And so so when Tobias said to me, what about that picture? I said, "Please ask me about it, because he should continue living." His name was Yeri Rimon. So
The book strikes me as particularly unique because as it's combining these different analyses of landscape and poetry, etc., you also are getting Nili's childhood, and also a little bit of these kinds of stories come out in the book of how Nili is rediscovering these locations. So one little snippet that came out from that research is that, and we'll move to the Zion Hotel, is that we know that in a person's life, you plan a lot, but also things, and your life does get informed by how you've planned, but your life also gets informed by accidents, coincidence, etc. And the Zion Hotel struck me as one great example of that, because there's obviously planning in its architecture and location, but the lot that it's on was actually the Arab owner said to whom?
to Mr. Dresner.
To Mr. Dresner, "Take a stone, throw it as far as you can, and that's where your lot will be." And then they made a price only after that manner of happenstance. So I love that little nugget.
So he threw it very, very far. He's got a large hotel.
And then also, as we talk about the Zion Hotel, do you want to introduce and read a little portion about the hotel?
Yeah. So the hotel was actually, there was one of the buildings of my that I remembered from my childhood, and it was in my neighborhood, but something happened there that was after I moved away from that neighborhood, but I would like to, I'll read it to you. In April 1960, my mother, my brother, and I entered the Zion Hotel, mere mortals, but left it covered with stardust. This was when Hollywood arrived in Haifa. In the spring of 1959, the famous American film director and producer Otto Preminger decided to make a film about the birth of the State of Israel based on the 1958 Zionist novel Exodus by Leon Uris. Furthermore, he was determined to shoot it on location in the newly established state. This would be the first American film to be shot in Israel, and its production would ultimately be credited, among other things, for its unmatched contribution to the development of the Israeli film industry. When he visited the country before shooting began, Preminger fell in love with its landscape and scrapped his original plan and decided to film it in color. He declared, "I want to show Israel the real star of Exodus. I can do this only in color." On January 26, 1960, he publicly announced that he had hired the blacklisted writer Dalton Trumbo to write the screenplay, becoming the first person who broke the blacklist. Filming began on March 28th, and the headquarters of the production was none other than the Zion Hotel in Haifa, which at the time was the fanciest hotel in the city. And so, for a glorious 6 months, Haifa became a film studio and shoot location all at once. The entire crew, about 500 people, were housed in the Zion Hotel, which was specially refurbished and fitted for the production needs and equipment. The entire building was exclusively at the crew's disposal, from its elegant halls to the basement, which was occupied by the costume department. Preminger stayed in the beautiful room 116, which overlooked the bay and part of the port. He famously used the view of Haifa and its port as the setting for the unforgettable, stunning opening scene of the movie that features the refugees crowded on the ship's deck. See how up to date, like nothing changes, right? Refugees crowded on the ship's deck facing the unattainable shore. When a large boat anchored in the port during the shooting, threatening to ruin the shot, Preminger commanded his general manager, "Get that ship out of the ocean, take it away, Martin." Now, my mother's maiden name was Preminger, and Otto was her father's first cousin. When he arrived in Haifa, she contacted him, and he invited us to the hotel. Imagine me, not yet 12 years old, walking up the wide marble steps, entering the spacious lobby, tiled with black speckled white marble, and sighting the divine Paul Newman with Eva Marie Saint at the bar. My mother carried a bouquet of flowers, and my brother and I were dressed in our Saturday best. We rode the elevator, the first I had ever taken, to Otto Preminger's room, where we were treated to soft drinks and cakes while my mother and the director chatted away in German. When I came to school the next day, all my classmates crowded around, trying to touch me. I told them how I'd seen Paul Newman and the other stars up close, and about the glamour of the lobby and the bar, and the likes of which we had seen only in movies, if at all. While working on the book, I interviewed Michael Dresner, the son of Avraham Dresner, the courageous man who built the Zion Hotel in 1937. We sat in his office in a building abutting the former hotel, which had long ago been swallowed by the municipal offices. My father was a Zionist, he told me, perhaps to interpret the name of the hotel. In any event, at first there were 28 rooms, and about a decade later we added another wing until it reached 110 rooms. Mr. Dresner also recounted how, when his father bought the first lot in the corner of Ibn Sina and Burveld in 1936, the Arab owner told him to throw a stone as far as he could, and the place where it fell would be the border of his lot. Only afterward did they calculate and determine the price, £1,000 sterling. So that was...
I particularly love that sequence because I'm sure there's some film theory book that has sort of a similar description of the creation of that movie, but to have your personal experience carry you through the story is really lovely.
But I have to tell you that I read the entire biography of Otto Preminger for that one page that I wrote. But it was really interesting because I did meet this very old man who was the son of the founder of the hotel, and he was very proud and actually happy to tell me about it.
Do we have a photo of the Zion Hotel or no?
There is a photo in the book. It's not, but actually, for those of you who go to Tel Aviv, and I'm sure many of you do, if you stay at the Dan Hotel in Tel Aviv, the fancy old Dan Hotel in Tel Aviv, the lobby was designed by the same person who designed the entrance to the Zion Hotel. His name was Penchel, and he was actually a movie set. He was a movie set designer who was invited to Hollywood during the 30s, where, when people started running away, and he decided to come to Israel instead, to Palestine at the time instead.
Great. So I think actually if there's anyone who wants to jump into the conversation with a question, we'll take some now and then come back to the music.
So I usually don't go to Haifa when I visit Israel. I grew up in Jerusalem, but I have actually a personal story that I discovered that my father's family came from Poland and they came to Haifa. This was the port in 1932. And I had an art show in Krakow and we did the research and they discovered so they had to give the passports. After they came to Haifa, there was a consulate, a Polish consulate. They had to give the passports, and then the passport went back to Poland. And someone in Warsaw found many passports of the Jews who came, and like 3,000 passports, mainly of rabbis, and people don't even know from the families that it exists. And this was very moving to find. So what I did, I took the pages of the passport, enlarged them, and made collage, and it says Haifa 1932, and it was just really.
And that's actually before the big refurbished port opened. The port was completed in 1933. The British completed it, so they came even before that.
Yeah, and there's an episode also in the book about passports coming into port. Yeah. Peter?
What was in your neighborhood and your sense as a child of the city as a whole, the relationship between Arabs and Jews at that point?
That's an important question.
And even what was the percentage of population?
That's a very heavy question, yeah. So when I started writing the book, when I was going to write about Haifa and in general and about Hadar Carmel inside Haifa, but I was going to write about other neighborhoods as well. And I had the amazing luck of meeting the head of the conservation department at the Haifa City Municipality, architect Walid Karkabi. And Walid Karkabi is a Christian Arab, but he's a communist, so he's not really Christian. But anyway, he was born Greek Orthodox. And I told him, I said, Walid, what do I do? I want to tell the story of Haifa. One cannot tell the story of Haifa without the story of the Arabs. But that's not my story. I don't know that story. So what do you suggest? He said, the first thing he said, write about Hadar Carmel. There were never Arabs in Hadar Carmel. Hadar Carmel was built on the slope. It was an empty slope. And you write about that neighborhood, which is yours. And I said, yes, but I cannot ignore. He said, okay, start at the seam line. So the first chapter of my book is actually called The Seam Line. The seam line is the line that goes between Hadar Carmel, the Jewish neighborhood, par excellence, and the Arab neighborhoods that were slowly coming up on the slope. And where those neighborhoods met is where that beautiful city hall, as well as the courthouse that I was telling you about, that was all built on the seam line, and those buildings, for the most part, are refurbished, and you can see them, and I highly recommend you go there. So that was the first thing. The second thing I wrote in that chapter was about the buildings, because I was born into Haifa that, as far as I knew, was Jewish. My Haifa, the Haifa I grew up in, was Jewish. The policemen spoke Hebrew. The city functioner, everything was in Hebrew. It was I thought Israel was there forever, right? I had no idea. But there were buildings in that neighborhood on the seam line. There were Arab buildings. They were stone buildings. And they were the witnesses. They were the mute witnesses of the people who used to live in them. And there were my mother's stories. My mother's stories of the landlord of the building she lived in, who was an Arab who left in 1948. There was her story about that building, which for us was the clinic, where we used to go to the doctor. And she said that's on top of that building the snipers set. And there was the window, and I write about it, there was the window in our apartment that had a hole in the, on the left side, a very deep gash that my father refused to fix because a bullet hit there, and my mother was pregnant with me, and only because of that thick wall I was not killed. But I studied a lot about that neighborhood and about what happened to the Arabs. And I came out ashamed and sad for what happened there. Because what happened in Haifa, yes, there was a war. And yes, for a variety of reasons, the Jews won. And the Jews won in Haifa even before May 15, even very, very early. This was the biggest victory, really, for Jews in Palestine. And here there was a city that was a mixed city. There were half Jews and half Arabs. And there were battles, but the battles were not between really the residents. The battles were between the people who fight, right? And Haifa, more than any other city, during the entire period, the pre-state period, was a city of coexistence and cooperation. And I write in detail about the Arab mayor, Hassan Shukri, for whom the main street of that neighborhood is named, and how he handled himself. And lo and behold, when the time came and it was clear that the Jews won, the Arabs and Jews in the city council met in the city council room where they met all those other times, and they were very good friends. They are really close friends. In that room, however, met also the heads of the Israeli or the Jewish forces at the time, as well as the British forces. And they suggested a ceasefire. They did not want to call it a surrender, a document of surrender. And they suggested a ceasefire, and when everything was near signing, the Arabs said they cannot sign, they need 24 hours. And the British and the Jews said, no, we can't do that. And finally they agreed on 4 hours. And they left, and what happened after that has many, many versions that I cannot tell you. One version is that they called their leaders in Damascus who told them to leave. And another version is that they tried to reach their leaders and never reached their leaders and were afraid to make a decision. But the outcome was that after 4 hours, the Muslim leaders did not come back to City Hall. The Christian leaders did and said, we cannot sign it. And we're going to tell the Arabs of Haifa to leave. Now, there were Jews, the local Jews, including the mayor, who at that time was Jewish, Shabtai Levi, who begged them to stay. And I remember my mother's stories, and I know this was before being politically correct or anything, my mother telling me about the cars going around in Haifa with loudspeakers, begging the Arabs to stay. But there were other forces. There were forces of the Haganah, there were military Jewish forces that did everything they could to scare the Arab population and to attack them and to make it clear that it's not a good idea to stay. And what happened between the day that the Arab forces fell in Haifa, which was April 21st, 1948, and May 15th, and maybe, is that about 50,000 Arabs left. They ran to the port because that was the only place they felt safe. That's where the British still were, and they got on boats. Many of them went to the Galilee, stayed in Israel. Many of them went to Lebanon and to other places. And the saddest piece of it is that when they wanted to come back, they were not allowed. So even if they thought they were going to go and then eventually the Arabs will win, whatever the Arab countries, and they were not, and it's an open wound to this day. And there's really, I cannot, I only learned about, like you asked about how does one find out about one's hometown? This is a story I didn't know. I knew about the buildings, I did not know the extent, and I did learn.
Maybe it's a very Arab Jewish city now, though, right?
Many Arabs moved from the Galilee into Haifa now, so it's now, Haifa still has the name of being tolerant. The first cultural center of Jews and Arabs together is in Haifa from the 50s, before it was fashionable, right? The Beit HaGeffen. Yes.
And I think some of that sadness and potential also comes out in your description of how the buildings had consciousness of trying to blend the communities, that the emblem of the city got redesigned to actually have the British as the centerpiece and the Jews and Arabs as equal.
What happens to say some good stuff about Haifa's handling, the symbol of the city of Haifa, the original symbol that is still at the head of Haifa City Hall, has a boat and a scroll underneath. And on the right side, it said in Hebrew, Haifa. On the left side, it said in Arabic, Haifa. And the center was in English, of course, because the British were the masters, Haifa. After the State of Israel was established, all the symbols were changed. In all the papers, Haifa in Hebrew became the center, English on the right, and Arabic on the left. Except on top of City Hall, nobody changed it. It still says Arabs and Jews are still equal on top of City Hall. So there is a lot of, remnants of architectural remnants.
Great.
I was born in Haifa.
Oh.
So your book and the whole discussion is very moving for me. There is a historical narrative, there is also a personal narrative. My family lived at the sea. And I'm a bit older than you are, Nili. And I remember us during the war, just before the war, how dangerous that neighborhood was, and we moved to Kiryat Bialik. And during the war, we lived actually in a hut, you can say, that had the roof leaking until some buildings, shikunim, were built for refugees like us. So that's a personal narrative which has nothing to do with the historical
It has a lot to
narrative
do.
you dealt with, but that's my memory of that period. But I want to go to the Technion, because years later I came back and studied at the Technion urban planning. And the building that you're talking about is one of the most beautiful buildings in Haifa. And today it is a science museum for children, and really very worthwhile.
Not only for children.
Listen, nothing for children. Adults can enjoy, children are going to do it. But it is really the most beautiful building. It's interesting that my memory of that building is not of the picture that you show, because the area This is
The
a
picture is from 1914.
Exactly. And the whole area is full now, and full when I was there, which was
Absolutely.
many years ago,
Yes.
full of other buildings. So it's much more urban than this particular picture. And actually, I never noticed the teeth.
We each have our own memories
Yes.
from the home
In the eyes
experience.
of the beholder, yeah.
Maybe we'll take 2 more questions if there are. Yeah.
So Nili, we'd like to hear a little bit about your family and their history and story and how they arrived there when.
So my family was actually the piece that I didn't continue reading. What I found out was that the owner of the Zion Hotel was from my mother's hometown, from Chernovitz. My mother came to Palestine in 1933, and she came to Tel Aviv. And work was scarce. Many people came, and she decided that 1940 was the best time to go to Haifa because the Italians were bombing Haifa, right? The Italians were a part of the Axis, and Haifa was British, and Haifa was in many ways the capital of the British Empire. It was the financial and industrial capital of the British Empire, definitely in the Middle East. There were the refineries, the oil refineries, the trains, the pipes that brought oil from Mosul, from Iraq to Haifa. And so they bombed, and many people ran away from Haifa. So my mother went to Haifa, and indeed got a very good job. So that was, and yes, and then I write about that. She met, and I don't know how, this woman who I only remember by the name of Frau Sturm, because children did not turn to adults by first name. So she was Mrs. Sturm, she was Frau Sturm. And my mother went to a cafe, because that's another very Haifa thing. My mother went to a cafe with Mrs. Sturm, with Frau Sturm. And when she sat there, this man walked in, a friend of Mrs. Sturm, or Frau Sturm. And Frau Sturm said, "I would like you to meet my friend, she's from Chernovitz." And my father said, "Chernovitz? I have a sister in Chernovitz." And my father came to Haifa under much less happy circumstances. My father had a business in Vienna, and the Anschluss was taken to Dachau. His wife managed to take him out from Dachau. His first wife, and they came to, I tell there are more sad parts to this story, but anyway, they came to Palestine, they settled in Haifa, they had family in Haifa, but for a while, right after the war, they found out that the daughter they had perished, and his wife died, and my father met my mother in that cafe, and 3 months later, he proposed to her in another cafe that was all around that kind of neighborhood, around very close to the Technion, where all the cafes were clustered. And they spoke German to each other, but they spoke Hebrew.
And in the book, the interplay between the trying to import German culture, but also having many Haifans having fled Germany is an interesting tension in the book. If there's one last question. Yeah?
How do you feel about the Bahai Gardens? Do you feel like they're stealing the focus of attention from Haifa?
If they're stealing the attention in Haifa?
Yeah, because people come, see the Bahai Garden, and then they just go away. So everything else.
Okay, so first of all, I think the Bahai is very beautiful. And I'll read you the first sentence in the book. Only the first sentence. And then I'll answer your question. When I was 7 or 8 years old, I thought that when you swam toward the shore from the sea, you would always encounter a forested mountain with a golden dome sparkling on its slope and white blocks of houses climbing upward. So the Golden Dome was very much a part of my landscape. When I did the research, I found out that the Golden Dome was only built in 1953, in other words, when I was 5. But I remember it as always having been there. What I have against the landscape of the Baha'i is that it's very unnatural. That if you look at this picture, right, the picture that is the cover of the book, this is a picture from the 60s. And you see the Baha'i dome is there, but the Versailles-looking gardens are not. And we don't have enough water. It's not a Carmel landscape. It's very, I think, foreign to the environment. However, the Baha'i take very good care of their gardens and of that. And they made the city, they now are dominant in the landscape. And I think and anything that brings people to Haifa and make it beautiful, and beauty has different interpretations. The reason I didn't write about it is that it's not in Hadara Carmel. It's not in my realm. But to me, it's unnatural. But I welcome it if it's a part of Haifa. When it's the only thing that one knows about Haifa, then it saddens me, because there's so many. I mean, Haifa has this amazing Bauhaus architecture, international style architecture that is so unique, that is not, that nobody, here, let me just, this will be my last,
Show these two?
Yeah. So this is arguably, I'll show, this is arguably the largest Bauhaus in the,
These are the front and back of the building.
front of back and back, I show this to this side.
Yeah.
The front and back of the same building. This is the Talpiot market in Haifa. Okay, the biggest Bauhaus structure in the world, like really a thing of beauty that was totally neglected. Nobody visited. However, I just learned that the Department of Conservation, headed by Walid Karkabi, is working on, they're beginning works on it. So it will, when you go back to Haifa in 5 years, it will be.
And what's the function of this building?
Now it's empty. It was the market. It was the market. So why don't you sing, and then if there are more questions or anything, or.
Sure. So there's a song called Haifa, nothing to hand out, written by Yonatan Geffen and performed by David Broza. The song is from the 80s, so after the period of the book. But do you want to highlight the phrase?
Yeah, this is a very, very cute song, Haifa, Haifa. But one of the verses is Ir im Atid, a city with a future. And it's very kind of tongue-in-cheek the way he uses it in the song. However, it is based, and it shows that the person who wrote the lyrics, who is a poet in his own right, knew the history. And when Theodor Herzl, for whom the main thoroughfare of Hadar Carmel is named, wrote his book, Alt Neuland, about the Jewish state that he envisioned. It's like a science fiction book. He writes it in 1902, published it in 1902, but it tells you what will happen, or what happened, in 1923. And in 1923, Haifa will be the center of the entire Middle East. And Herzl called it, in 1902, he called Haifa the city of the future. Herzl died in 1904, he never saw it become what it became, but Yonatan Geffen remembered that line and inserted it in the song.
Yeah, and the song's in Hebrew, of course, but generally the song is about just the workaday life in Haifa, working at the port and whatnot. So I'm going to ask for your help in the chorus. So we all sing together, and I'll work out the melody, Haifa, Haifa. Then I have 3 words, and then you guys come back in with whoa. And that sequence happens 3 times, but there's a long rest in the 3rd. But we'll work it out by the 4th chorus. אישה ויש לי ילד ואבא שלי עובד בנמל הולכים לישון בדיוק ב10 כי לא רוצים לבזבז חשמל חיפה חיפה עיר עם עתיד חיפה חיפה עיר עם תחתית חיפה חיפה עיר אמיתית ואבא בבוקר אני כבר עסוק 2 אוטובוסים לבית הזיקוק עובד מזיע אני רק פועל עד שהערב יורד בכרמל חיפה חיפה עיר עם תחתית חיפה חיפה עיר עם עתיד חיפה חיפה עיר אמיתית חושבים שבחיפה כולם אבודים אבל האמת היא אנחנו עובדים יחי הפועל בסרבל האפור כאן נולדתי וכאן גם אגמור בחיפה חיפה חיפה עיר עם תחתית חיפה חיפה עיר עם עתיד חיפה חיפה עיר אמיתית